monetizing content, especially with podcasts, can be challenging. You have to think about nurturing your audience, collaborating with brands, and most importantly, creating content that resonates. The author of Samurai Sword Murders, Sizzlers, and the creator and host of the True Crime South Africa podcast, Nicole Engelbrecht, shares her creative process.
Essentially, I'm creating the type of content I would want to either listen to or read. When I'm creating an episode or writing a book, whatever it may be, I'm creating around a set of values that I know I've attracted this audience that resonates with those values.
She also lets us in on how she nurtures a growing podcast audience and connects with brands to partner with.
Brands are attracted to sponsoring True Crime South Africa because their values align with the podcast's values. That's really what I've found it to be, because I'm very lucky to say that I've actually never approached a brand to sponsor the podcast.
For more insights on growing your audience, monetizing your content, and finding ways as brands of partnering with creators, keep listening. Welcome to the Lead Creative Podcast, where we talk to creative industry leaders, influencers, and brands. We discuss the strategies that influence brand thinking and shape industries. Thought leaders and heads of agencies let us in on some of their thinking and insights. I'm your host, Mongezi Mtati. Enjoy the show, and please share and subscribe. Nicole, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us on The Lead Creative. First of all, congratulations on your latest book, Sizzlers. I know that you've been doing a lot of conversations around that. How has that been?
Yeah, that's been amazing. So firstly, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor, a privilege. It's been a crazy time. I'm actually doing 2 books this year. So I've just released another one as well, very recently, a couple of days ago. But it's been amazing. It's an important story that I wanted to tell for the victims and their families. So it's been I think a rewarding experience for everyone involved so far.
Yeah. Let's just go a little bit back, Nicole, to, we all have a story of when we were growing up, we wanted to be this or we wanted to be that, right? So growing up, did you always wanted to be a storyteller? Like, what stories, I suppose, resonated with you that led you to this point?
If I look back from the age of 6 years old, I was wanting to, I was excited to learn how to write and how to read. I was always an avid reader, and once I learned to write, I think storytelling sort of started there for me. I have a clear memory of around 6 or 7 years old, me looking at a book and seeing someone's name on the front and asking, how did that person get their name on the front of that book? So, it's looking back, it's absolutely been something that I think I was born with, and it was a hobby for me over the years. And I think everyone who writes has at some point aspirations of being published in some form. But I think that I had come to terms with the fact that that wasn't going to be possible for me as a career, and I'd gone into corporate, and I'd sort of thought I'd laid those dreams to rest, and that's not what ended up happening.
And you've told very fascinating stories since, because in your book, Sizzlers, that I just mentioned, and the Samurai Sword Murder, as well as in the True Crime podcast, you humanize very complex and painful stories. How do you build your content?
Yeah, so I think the very most important part of this for me is firstly honoring the victims. The podcast and all my true crime content, including the books, is victim focused. That's a very, I do that on purpose. So for me, the biggest part of telling the story in my genre is research. I can't tell the story without the facts, without the details. And I really think, sometimes I think that's what sets maybe my content apart a little bit, is that my style of storytelling is the detail. So that research part is incredibly important in the storytelling process for me. And then because my content is always victim focused, I very intentionally want to get the victim across. And I don't say this
Hmm.
lightly, but almost as a character to the listener or the reader. And
Sure,
the
sure.
reason I do that is because when we consume this type of content, it can be easy for us to think that these people are just names on a page.
Yeah.
So what I try and do through building the story and building these people up as characters in the consumer's mind
Yes.
is to get across the reality that these are real stories, that these are real things that people either lived through or passed away from. And
Mm.
so that is really the basis of my storytelling, is focusing as much as I can on building this as using the ordinary elements of storytelling, so character,
Sure.
plot, and again, those can sound quite light in this context, but
Yeah.
those for me are very important in getting across my actual intention, which is to give these victims a voice.
At the back of all of this, though, there is a creative process as well, right? You've got your own style. Like you said, a big part of your style is the detail and not just we talk about humanizing people, but you humanize them to the point of making them a character in the stories that you tell. And I get that being a follower of your podcast as well. But there's also this creative process. How do you then marry the creative process with the storytelling and humanizing people? Because somewhere in there, for me, at least as an outsider looking in, is this thing of you also work. I get this feeling that you work alone, and you mentioned this quite a bit in the beginning and end of the podcast. How do you know, without having a sounding board, that this will resonate, especially when you aren't someone who's on TV or writing for a newspaper, for instance, where you almost instantly get that feedback that this is my audience? How do you then, craft that story creatively in the creative process at the back, and also just, yeah, knowing that the story will resonate and how well it resonates?
It's an interesting question, because I think really what it's been for me is, and I think it might be the same for many creatives, is if you are creating content, no matter what it may be, we're all creating content with a specific user in mind, a specific consumer in
Sure.
mind. And for me, being a true crime content consumer myself, essentially I'm creating the type of content I would want to either listen to or read. So I
Yeah.
think that what I've noticed in the podcast journey especially is my style of storytelling doesn't resonate with everyone, but it resonates
Hmm.
with the people who have similar sets of values to me when it comes to true crime and what I want to get out of this type of content. So I really think that's what I go back to, is when I'm
Sure.
creating a episode or writing a book, whatever it may be, I'm creating around a set of values that I know I've attracted this audience that resonates with those values. And
Yeah.
the audience that doesn't resonate with those values has fallen away and gone to a different content creator, which is fine. That's what we do as consumers.
Mm.
So I think that's really what it is for me, is that creative process is really resonating off those strong values that I've tried to continue through the podcast and the books. And if I feel that the content as I create it is resonating with that, I have a really good idea that it will resonate with the listeners and the readers.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you know when one story is worth unpacking further into a book and another one not so much? And I'm sure it's difficult to tell, because all the stories that you tell are stories that really, grab the listener and are so relevant and pertinent in all our lives, whether it's a story of a true crime story, or from the 90s or from the 2000s or from the 80s or 70s. All of them are really compelling stories. How do you know that this one, I should unpack into a book such as Sizzlers, and that one should just be a podcast episode?
I think the criteria is certainly different because of the process of creating it. So my podcast is independent. I make the decisions about which stories I cover, and I have my criteria that I use to choose the stories I cover on the podcast, which ideally I want to be talking about cases that haven't received a lot of coverage. That's always my
Yeah,
main goal, is to give a platform to voices that have not been elevated before. So that's
yeah,
really the criteria for the podcast. Is firstly, is there enough information for me to tell a cohesive story, valid,
sure,
concrete information, and in doing so, am I again sticking with the podcast values of resonating
sure.
these what I call silent victims, that we don't see in the big headlines. When it comes to books, it's a little bit different because I'm not doing that independently. I'm doing it with a publisher whose
Yeah,
goal, there's a very thin line to walk between creating something that's going to sell and creating something that still aligns again with my content creation values. So there we're looking
yeah,
for books where that are relevant, stories that are still relevant to us today, which
sure.
many stories are if we look deep enough. But we've got to have those aspects of, if we look at Sizzlers, the LGBTQ elements, very relevant to us still
Yeah,
today. The parole element, very, relevant to us today. So really, that's for books. We've got to have that current relevance, and it's got to be
sure.
something that a much larger audience is going to consume, because there is that input from the publishers where, let's face it, they need to make their investment back.
You keep mentioning your audience, and I want to just get into building an audience, and I think how you build or how you built your audience. There's I don't know if this is true or not with you, but there's always this idea of a tipping point, right? Once you have 100 followers on this platform, then everything kind of tips and you start building almost automatically. Was there a point like that for you in building your audience? And at what point did you realize that you were onto something that was going to be bigger than you thought it would be?
I think very early on, it was already bigger than I thought it was going to be, because I started this podcast as part of a creative entrepreneurship, sort of a portfolio of different things I was going to be doing. And I honestly just thought it was going to be a hobby. It was, I
Sure.
realized the possibilities, but never in a million years did I think it would be what it is now. But it was, I think, I would probably say about a year in, when I realized that there were enough people out there that were listening, that were bought into this journey. And it wasn't just the stories that they were listening to in the podcast. They had bought into the journey of me being this person with no criminological background or anything in law enforcement, learning about these cases and this world of true crime along with them, and educating them
Sure.
along the way and telling these stories along the way. And I think for me, of course, when journalists started approaching me for interviews, that was a tipping point. But really, what made me
Right.
realize that there was a large, growing group of really committed and bought in listeners was I had to I started a Patreon account at one point. And at
Yes.
first, for the first probably 9 months, I couldn't commit to doing any extra content on that Patreon account. All I could offer was a shout out on the podcast. Because it
Sure.
was just, I would never be able to do it time wise. And even though that's all I was offering, I think I got up to like 200 Patreons just offering a shout out. And considering the economic situation in South Africa back then, sort of 2020-ish, and now, to me, that's amazing that people would give their hard-earned
Mm-hmm.
money just to be able to be part of this process. So I think that was one of the biggest things for me, was just recognizing, that there were all these people that were really bought into what was happening and wanted to be a part of the journey.
If you're enjoying The Lead Creative, please share this episode with your network and hit follow or subscribe. Enjoy the show. And I think when you've built something to that point, you start having a relationship, right, with this audience, who also have a relationship with the content that you've created over time. Let's talk about, I think, Patreon and monetizing a little bit, because that is also an important part of being able to keep creating, right? How much of that helps you sort of build and create the content? Because of course there are costs to be covered in all of this, right? And I know that you have sponsors as well, and I want to talk about that journey. But how good is, say, a Patreon in helping to build your content, or help you maintain the content that you're creating?
Yeah, look, I must say that because of the genre I podcast in, it was actually a very difficult decision for me to monetize the podcast. I
Yeah.
had an internal battle, which perhaps podcasters in other genres won't have, where I was, let's face it, I'm monetizing people's misery. That is the basis of what the true crime content genre is. But then I had to balance that with, am I doing real world good, and do those two things marry up enough for me to be able to monetize this? And
Yeah. Yeah.
as leads started to come in on cases and cold cases, and the podcast started to do real world good, I think I felt less conflicted about monetizing it, because I had to, as you said, time is money.
Yeah.
I had
Yeah.
to pay the bills somehow. And in order to be able to continue making this real world change, that was a necessary part. And
Yeah.
really what that's helped me to do is, Patreon, for instance, has been an enormous, for a long time, it was the biggest financial income from the podcast. And that
Yeah.
just helps me to be able to really pay a couple of bills, so that I don't have to take on other projects and things like that, and I can focus more on telling more stories and, hopefully making more real world change with the podcast.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, over time, from listening to the episodes, I get this sense of deepening the knowledge and understanding of South African true crime as I listen to more and more episodes from your podcast. So I get that. So something else that research has found, is more so their Pew Research Center, is that nearly half of all content on Apple Podcasts is true crime. So it goes without saying that, crime is one of those things, more so true crime is one of those things that we are all familiar with. It connects us, whether you are in Joburg or New York City or LA or London or whatever the case is. But for you, why true crime? Why that genre specifically?
Um, yeah, so it's an interesting one, and the answer to that question has developed over time. At first, when people ask me that question, I would say it's really just because I enjoy true crime myself, and South Africa didn't have a true crime podcast, and I thought it could use one. There's also elements of, when I was in high school, one of my classmates' sisters was very sadly kidnapped and murdered, and being so young, that had a huge impact on me. In my most recent book that I've just co-authored, though, there's a little bit of a different answer to that question, so I'm probably going to have to start sharing that in interviews, because it's all out there now. So in Killer Stories, I share a little bit about my childhood and my family and my background, and how there were individuals in my family who were involved in sort of criminal enterprises, if you'd like to call it that. So that was something that, that, and I think experiencing a little bit of, seeing domestic violence and substance abuse growing up. Now I realize that that has all played into my interest in how offenders develop and the people that end up becoming victims. So yeah, I think that's the more well-rounded answer that I can give to that question now, 5 years later.
Yeah, yeah. A part of it is definitely personal, and from personal stories, or at least personal experiences that you've had. In your view, though, what about true crime in general makes storytellers gravitate towards this genre so much so that it becomes nearly half of content on one of the podcasting platforms? What is it about this genre that you believe makes storytellers or creators want to tell more of these stories?
I think at the very base of it is probably human curiosity. If we think about what causes a traffic jam when there's an accident, it's not the accident itself, it's people rubbernecking to look at what's happened. And I think that true crime, the interest in that, there's a lot of that. It's a lot
Sure.
of us wanting to understand what we think makes us different from the offenders and the victims. There's a lot of wanting to dig down into the psychology side of it. I think we hope that we'll find many, many differences between, the offenders and the victims so that we can say it'll never be us. But the truth is that there's not that much difference. And I also
Yeah.
think it's just the mystery of it, everyone really, I think, is interested in a mystery that's solved, and I think that's often why you find podcasts that have an ending where the case is solved will be more popular
Yeah.
sometimes than the unsolved cases. So I think it's really those different elements. It's the mystery, it's the human curiosity, and then also the psychological side of it.
Yeah, I think, and for me, I think as a listener, one of the things to your point is I'm always trying to understand the person, the kind of people who would have committed these crimes, and we usually don't get those kinds of answers.
Mm.
And somehow I feel like I wish court cases would ask those questions, like, why did you do it, and try to understand those people, but we
Yeah.
never get that. How open have you found South African brands to be in sponsoring podcasts?
Mm. I think my journey with sponsorship has been quite interesting because, in the beginning I thought, well, what kinds of brands are going to want to partner with the True Crime podcast? Surely it's going to have to just be security or, things like that. And really what I've found that's been so interesting to me is that I've got such a wide array of different types of brands that have partnered with the podcast,
Yeah, yeah.
and they've really been very open to it in terms of what I think it's been on reflection is brands are attracted to sponsoring True Crime South Africa because their values align with the podcast's values. That's really what I've found it to be, because I'm very lucky to say that I've actually never approached a brand to sponsor the podcast. All of the brands that have
Right.
sponsored the podcast throughout the years have approached me. And I mean, I think that's huge in terms of many of these people are listeners of the podcast, and really they're seeing the value that the podcast is adding despite or because of the genre that it's in. So yeah, that's been a really interesting reflection for me on brands, and how you don't really need to align that brand with the content. It doesn't have to be a security brand advertising on a true crime
Yeah,
podcast,
yeah.
for instance. It's really more of a value alignment. you know, own values and the value that the brand is getting. That's the alignment that you're looking for in sponsors.
So two things on that. The first is something I like to ask brands themselves, which is we constantly talk about values. Our values align with our customers. Our values align with our listeners or viewers. Like, how do you know? Because again, as a customer, I like brand X of sneakers. I like brand Y of t-shirts. And a lot of the time it's not even about the values. It's about the fit. It's about how it feels. It's about all these other
Yeah.
things. How do you firstly communicate those values for you to know that for a brand to know that our values align?
Mm.
And the second part is at what how do you then reject a brand whose values don't align with your values, and how do you know that, right?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, interesting question. So I think, I mean, you know, in my case, when a brand has approached me, I think they've already made the decision that their values align with mine, and I've got
Sure.
to make the decision the other way around. You know, but in
Yeah.
general, if really it's for me, it's about there's all these elements, but it's really about how does a brand, a podcast, a piece of content make you feel?
Mm-hmm.
You know, for me, I think the values that I hopefully put out into the world are elements of trust, elements of care, elements of empathy, elements of doing things not just for the sake of doing them, but with a
Yeah.
bigger purpose behind them. And
Sure.
that's what I look for. You know, those sound like really big things, and they are. So when I look at a brand and I decide if they really do align with the podcast, it's pretty easy to see, I think, you know, the brands that stand out as really not in alignment with what I do. And
Mm-hmm.
thankfully, that experience has been it's happened very seldom for me. Social media
Yeah.
is a great way to sort of tell how the world is responding to a brand and how a brand is making the world feel about what they're putting out there. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so it's difficult, and in terms of expressing that a brand is not a good fit, I mean, honesty is everything.
Yeah.
I luckily have not yet had a situation where I've had a brand approach me that I didn't think was a fit. There've been one or
Mm.
two documentaries that I've turned down doing sort of influencer work for because that didn't align with me. But it's really
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
knowing what you as a person and as a brand stand for. And after a couple
Yeah.
of conversations, I think it becomes pretty clear whether how it makes you feel is how you want to make other people feel.
Mm. Mm. So something I've noticed listening to your podcast is, I think, to your point about influencer documentaries, is that there will be every now and again a Showmax documentary that you would talk about, or a or a true crime documentary that you would talk about. What would brands like a Showmax, for instance, be look for in a podcast? Because this is one of those sort of, how long is a piece of string type questions among podcasters. Like, is it a numbers thing? Is it a number of subscribers? Is it the quality of my audience? Where do you kind of draw that line? Because one podcast is about pop culture and it talks to people who are within the pop culture scene, so it will have everybody and their dogs listening to that podcast, whereas yours is very niche. It's about a very specific topic, and these podcasts become even more and more and more niche. Like, somebody else might talk about vintage sports cars. That's a very niche audience. So what do brands look for? Is it a numbers thing? Is it
Mm.
quality of audience? And how do you prove it either way?
Mm. So I think reach is always going to be important. For me, it's been So just as an example, Showmax, the individual who started out that whole process was a listener of the podcast. So that was, I think, for them was a no-brainer. True crime podcast, true crime documentaries, that sort of married up. But really, I think what's really interesting to look at where I think podcast advertising is so, and podcast partnerships are so useful, is that even if the content, if the niche is not your exact niche, if the audience, the demographic, the type of interest, the LSM level, if those people are the people that match up with your brand, no matter what your product is, that is already useful. And then to add to that, you've got, so what I think is very important is the podcasters' level, the trust level that they have with their listeners. How much do their listeners actually trust the podcaster? Because then they're going to trust their recommendations, which is a very big responsibility for the podcaster, but very powerful for the brand. So that's what it is for me. And the niches, I always say to podcasters, don't stress too much about how big your listening audience is. And I think brands see this because in types of advertising like radio, it's almost a hit and miss.
Sure.
If a really niche car brand is advertising on radio, they've got maybe a 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000 chance that they're going to get to their ideal user. But with podcasts, it doesn't matter if you've only got 100 listeners. That brand has already got a 100 in 100 chance of reaching their ideal audience. So, it's already more valuable than the radio adverts, for instance. So I think those are the types of considerations I've seen being valuable to the brands that I've dealt with in terms of advertising on podcasts.
If you're enjoying The Lead Creative, please share this episode with your network and hit follow or subscribe. Enjoy the show. I've noticed something, though, about your podcast as well, right? And I don't know, maybe this might have been in episodes that I maybe didn't listen to at the time. I've noticed that there are certain brands that you partner with, and there are certain brands that I've never known you to partner with. For instance, to use a common example, I'd never known you to partner with an alcohol brand. I haven't heard you talking about an alcohol brand, for instance, as a sponsor in your podcast. Are you specific about the kinds of brands and products that you partner with? Because you spoke about credibility, and I think credibility is one of those really important things. I mean, I spoke to someone in our previous episodes about influencer marketing and the credibility that comes with influencer marketing. If you talk about a lifestyle brand today, and tomorrow you talk about an alcohol brand, does your following really trust you, and do you build credibility? So in your case, there's a certain level of credibility because of the kinds of products and brands that you partner with. Are you specific about them, or would you partner with any types of brand that whose values match up with yours, as you've just said?
That's a very interesting point, and I think maybe the alcohol example is very good. I mean, it would actually be pretty pointless for me personally to partner with an alcohol brand because I don't drink, firstly. And also, I think it wouldn't align with the podcast values, no matter how responsible that alcohol brand is, because of how much substance use and substance abuse does play into the cases that I talk about. So I think that would be a very bad partnership, not because the brand in question might not be responsibly advertising and hoping to responsibly market their product, but simply because for me personally that wouldn't line up. So yeah, I think there is definitely an intentional consideration around the types of brands I would align with. and yeah, certain product lines, certain brands just wouldn't fit it, and I'd have
Yeah.
to step away from those.
Yeah. So your audience is a very important, I think, cornerstone or foundation to the content, as you've mentioned, and also credibility is also a very important part of it. What should podcasters consider when partnering with brands? Are there any sort of things, or is it on an individual basis? Because I think for you, I mean, the credibility, consistency, understanding your audience and values are really important parts, as I've gathered from our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, my audience, the audience building has been also been something that I've had to look back at in retrospect to really understand how it's happened. And it's been quite incredible to see how over the years, the types of people that listen to the podcast and engage on social media, because let's face it, not everyone that's engaging on social media is often listened to the podcast and vice versa.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting to me to see how that audience has evolved over the years. And sort of almost really become champions for the podcast.
Right.
Mentioning it's really cool to me to just be scrolling through Reddit, for instance, and just see a mention of the podcast somewhere where someone's really, recommending it. That's been incredibly important. And I think for podcasters, authenticity is key in building your audience, because that goes back to your audience is going to end up hopefully trusting you, and keying in with the fact that you are who you really say you are, and you're not one person on the podcast and another person in real life.
And I think something else that I'd like us to unpack a bit more is how the audience has, that thing you said about how the audience has evolved over the years, because audience is evolving. The more we become connected, especially in South Africa and Africa, the audience also grows, right? I think one of the things about creating content on the internet is this idea that not very many South Africans are connected, right? Like we mentioned radio as an example. So it's like you'll never have as much audience as a radio station does, even though that's also dwindling. How do how has your audience evolved, and what are the things that you're noticing about the growth of of podcast listenership?
So I think from when I started doing this 5 years ago to now, I mean, number one, the number of people that are listening to podcasts in general in South Africa is far greater. I hope that we have managed to maybe break down some of the data. I think data plays a big role in South Africa in terms of accessing podcasts because is internet based. Um, I think that I am personally most certainly starting to see a wider range of types of people listening to my podcast, which I love.
Yeah,
I have never wanted to be a sort of high LSM, people in a high socioeconomic class. I don't want that to be my core audience. I want it to be the
for
average
sure.
South African. And I think I have started to see that happening. And that's one of the most exciting things for me, not just for True Crime South Africa, but for all podcasts. As we've started to see people start to make podcasts in all of our national languages, speaking to experiences that are important to all the majority of South Africans. We've started to see those voices find the ears that they need to find, and that's been
Yeah.
incredibly exciting for me to see.
While your podcast is, of course, True Crime South Africa and focuses on local stories, there's your audience isn't only and always local, but you've also got an international audience or listenership as well. In terms of the brands that you say have approached you for sponsorship, are you finding that international and local brands are different in their approach? Are international brands amenable to a local sort of podcast? And how different are they from local brands in the same sense?
So I think I've seen that shift over the years. Right in the beginning, so my split is about 70% South African listeners and 30% other countries, USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And I think in the beginning, I found that local brands were very amenable to local podcasts, to True Crime South Africa, while international brands, and it was quite strange because it was even brands that would easily be accessed by South Africans, internet apps and that sort of thing that would easily be accessed by a South African audience. The international
Yeah.
brands just weren't interested. But recently, I'd say in the last year or so, I have seen a shift in that. And I don't think it's got to do with my numbers. I think it's got to do with, in general, international brands seeing that the podcasting space in South Africa is growing. That
Right.
we do have a country that has buying power to a certain extent, despite our economy being quite tough, that this is an important audience. So I have seen that shift, and international brands being a lot more amenable when they are bringing their brands to our country. So an example could be Ring Security, who's just launched in South Africa. But even when they're hoping to reach our audience, just to promote their brand across all regions. I'm
Yeah.
definitely
Yeah.
starting to see South African podcasts more accepted as a platform for international brands as well.
Interesting. Interesting. Nicole, so we usually ask our guests to leave a question for our next guest. And our previous guest on the podcast was Tando Gambushe, who is an influencer marketing lead within the FMCG space. And the question she left for you was, if there were no barriers on how disruptive you could be, what would you change? What would you disrupt?
Wow. Very interesting. I think my answer to that question will probably be very different because it's not. My disruption would be in the areas that I've seen the most difficulty in the people that I've spoken to for my podcast. So really my area of disruption would be if I could disrupt the sort of legal infrastructures and the parole infrastructures and those sorts of things to bring immediate and important change for victims of violent crime in South Africa, that is where I would focus my energy. If I could snap my fingers and make a huge change that's really required in that area, I definitely think that's where I'd focus that.
Interesting. Now, the same question for you. What's the one question that you'd ask our next guest about their work, their creative process, thoughts on the industry, or anything, or about life for that matter? What question would you leave them?
That's an interesting one. I would ask them if they look back at call it their 18-year-old self, what does that 18-year-old self think about the person they currently are, professionally and personally, if they wish to answer that as well? And is that 18-year-old self proud of who they currently are?
Sure. Okay. Okay. All right. No, that's a fascinating question outside of work. No, awesome. That's interesting. Now, Nicole, the last question I think for you then is if you could ask any living person their take on marketing, creativity, or life, who would that person be, and what's the one question that you would ask them?
You've got good questions, Mongezi. um,
I try. We try to bring out our best questions for this for our smartest guests.
oh, goodness. Let's see. Goodness. You know, and again, I'm probably going to have to give you the unexpected answer, but you did know that you were having a true crime podcast on. I think I'd probably have to, it might have to be a perpetrator of a crime that I've covered, and I'd have to ask them to give me 5 or 10 minutes of their time and tell me about, again, the story of who they were when their lives went wrong and so badly impacted someone else's life, and the story of who they think they are now.
Fascinating question once again. Nicole, thank you so much for making the time to chat with us. I think the biggest thing I think that I take away from this is being authentic to your craft, your audience, and as a result, attracting the kinds of brands that match the values that you've built.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's been fantastic. I really, really appreciate being on the podcast. It's been such a joy.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you for listening to The Lead Creative. Did you get one insight that's worth sharing from this episode? Please share it with your network or your friends. Pop me some of your ideas and innovative finds on Twitter on @Mongezi. This podcast is available on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find me on mongezi.com.